Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for turning out for the meeting. Some of you may have come because you saw some posters. We also did some leaflets, and in the leaflets it was just explained that the reason we're having this meeting, it's not a debate, it's just a talk. It's heavily one-sided, which is great. The argument being that you're already bombarded on the television, in the media, on websites, and in the educational establishments with evolution. So this is just going part way to, rectifying that balance. Well, I was going to do a little bit of a biography about our speaker tonight, but he's told me to dispense with that completely. So I am. So I'm just here to do the boring but important notices. So please, if you've got a mobile phone, make sure it's on silent or switched off. Second thing is, if there's any sort of emergency, fire or anything, you'll know the exit because you'll see a screaming mob heading out that way. So most of you I think you all came in that way. So yeah, any emergency you can go out that way. If you need to, you can also use this door here, but please don't use that one. It's a little bit dangerous. So we've got at least 2 exits in case of emergency. The format of the meeting really is just that Dr. Sarfati is going to speak for about 40-50 minutes, and then we're going to have a Q&A, questions and answer time afterwards, and then we'll make our way downstairs for those who want refreshments. Most importantly, there's a bookstall in the basement there, so please do avail yourself of those resources, some great books on there. To get downstairs, you can either go out the way you came in and down the outside steps. They're a little bit dark, so you may prefer to use these ones. These ones are a little bit steep, so you have to choose which is the less dangerous way of getting downstairs. So it's out the side or down these steps, and we've got refreshments and a bookstall there. And toilets. There's a toilet out the back. Is that in order, Edward? That one there. And there's also one downstairs. And the final thing really is just about the clipboards. You will see some clipboards going round. Dom is taking one round. And it's really just for those who are not on the mailing list. So please do sign up. It's just to get regular emails of Creation Ministries International. Well, I kept that as short as I could. So I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Jonathan Sarfati of Creation Ministries International. Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming out on a Thursday night for this important topic. I guess I better first explain that I don't come from this country. Here is where I come from. We actually moved to the Northern Hemisphere, to the United States about 6 years ago so we could visit our granddaughters. It was much easier to visit grandkids when they're in the same country as you, not over thousands of miles of ocean. Now, I'm also a PhD scientist. I used to shine lasers onto selenium ring molecules and look at the scattered radiation, published a work in specialist scientific journals. So don't let anyone bluff you by claiming there aren't any real scientists who believe the Bible. Okay, I'm one of them, and in fact we have a book called Busting Myths downstairs, which has 30 PhD scientists in different fields explaining why they believe the Bible. Now, another hobby, I'm a chess master. That's a little hobby of mine, playing chess from memory, like in that picture here. Played with some good people in my time. Another thing is, I'm actually ethnically Jewish. My name is the Hebrew word for Frenchman, so I guess I can tell Jewish jokes and French jokes and get away with it. Now, why would a Jew like me believe in Jesus or Yeshua in Hebrew? Well, he fulfilled many prophecies of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, in his first coming. And some of those prophecies have an expiry date on them, which means it must have been him. But of course, a lot of what I do now is dealing with this man. So basically, he is the patron, the saint of the religion of the government schools in the Western world, and the judiciary, the bureaucratic system. It's all based on Darwinian evolution. Now, if people don't hear about the other side, where they're going to go, they're going to go by what they've been taught in the schools. And they think that evolution is science and Christianity is religion. But in fact, the Bible talks about history and science and does so accurately, while evolution really is not a real science. And one place you can find about this for free is creation.com, our website with over 11,000 articles on it. So if there's something you want to query about creation, you can just type into our search box here. Very easy to find an article about what you're looking for. And it's updated every day with something new and topical. One thing we found, evolution turning pastors into atheists. So it's a pretty serious thing I'm talking about. Now, one way you can be connected with this is to get our free email newsletter called the Info Bites. And again, we promise not to spam you or to sell your address to any third party, but it keeps you up with what's going on on our site and answers to things which might be topical in the media, like the latest missing link or the Big Bang Theory. Go ahead, guys, and pass, please. Thanks. Yes, please. And some of the books you might like downstairs, my latest book is called The Genesis Account. It's a commentary on Genesis 1 to 11. I mean, this is one commentary which is not afraid to tackle the objections by so-called science. I mean, what commentary do you know that talks about where dinosaurs fit in, or carbon dating, or design of life, or natural selection, or where races came from, as well as how the New Testament authors and Jesus himself understood Genesis? Because whatever Jesus said surely should be binding on what Christians believe about Genesis. Now, another guy you might have heard of, he comes from this part of the world, is a man called Richard Dawkins, who's a famous atheist and evolutionist and uses Darwinism to push his atheistic religion. And he writes a book called The Greatest Show on Earth, The Evidence for Evolution. And one of my books is called The Greatest Hoax on Earth. Refuting him, we try to deal with the best arguments evolutionists have, while they usually ignore the best arguments creationists have and knock down straw men. Now, the first part of my talk is also dealt with in this video here called The Christian Roots of Science. Now, first of all, I want to talk about what science is and what it isn't. Like, the real science that put men on the moon and cures diseases and builds technology, you might call operational science or observational science, things you can test and observe and repeat. You see, it's a scientific claim that water boils at 100 degrees. Mind you, where I live now, it boils at 212 degrees. It's a bit strange. But you can test this for yourself. Don't just take my word for it. Now, what about evolution, though? You see, did anyone really see a fish evolving into an amphibian 300 million years ago? No, this evolution's a claim about the past. It's a claim about history, not about science, which deals with the present. Now, certainly we are digging up the present. We don't really dig up the past. That's a bit of a myth, because if we didn't dig it up in the present, we wouldn't see it. But you see, from the present data, we try to make up a scenario of history to explain how the present came to be. But the fish fossil doesn't come with a label saying it's millions of years old. That's an interpretation of the data. It's not the data itself. Now, I can apply this to the Grand Canyon. You see, the Grand Canyon clearly exists in the present because we can go and see it. And you've got these huge rock layers. You see how flat and smooth they are, and this huge miles-deep gash in the ground, in those rock layers. And since no one saw it formed, how do we understand how it got here? Now, an evolutionist typically would say, well, this is what a little bit of water does over a lot of time. And I'm going to say, well, this is what a lot of water does over a little bit of time. You see, in science, you can always trade intensity for time. You see, the Bible talks about a worldwide flood. And you think about what the runoff of a worldwide flood is going to do, it may well carve something as huge as the Grand Canyon. You see, the other idea, a little bit of water like the Colorado River, doesn't make so much sense because the Colorado River would have had to flow uphill to carve the Grand Canyon, which doesn't seem likely to me. And it's also way too small. I've been to the Grand Canyon, you stand near the rim and try and see the river down. It's very hard to see it. You tell me this tiny little river carved this enormous canyon, and this is a phenomenon right throughout the world. We have rivers far too small for the valleys they're in. So it points to a much larger amount of water. Now, in fact, on a smaller scale, we saw this, an analogy to this with Mount St. Helens in western United States, like this little Grand Canyon, 40th the scale of the Grand Canyon, about 40 meters deep, and this was carved in a single day by a mud flow going through solid basalt rock. And this comes from the Creation magazine, I'll be explaining a bit later. But the point is, again, when you have lots of water, you don't need lots of time. And this canyon here, you see how this river is going through, but this river didn't cause the canyon caused the river. And this is why what I think happened with the Grand Canyon, the same sort of thing, much larger amount of water carved this in 2.5 years, and now the river is following the path carved out for it by this much bigger volume. Now, just about what I'm talking about now, we have articles on our website. This one is called creation.com/roots, the biblical roots of modern science, talking about what historically actually drove modern science to begin. And you see that's Sir Isaac Newton, the greatest scientist who ever lived, but he wrote more about the Bible than about science. And this one here, creation.com/why science, is why does science work at all? And it goes through the logic, what is actually required for science even to work. And one of the things that's required is that we have objective reality. Now, in the Bible, it tells you God created the heavens and the earth. There is objective reality. Furthermore, man wasn't created till day 6, so there's objective reality that doesn't depend on what humans think about it. See, it doesn't matter whether you believe the law of gravity is true or false. If you drive off a cliff, you're going to find out how true it really is. It doesn't depend on what you think about it. There's objectivity there. But there are some philosophies that deny objective reality. Postmodernism basically denies objective reality, except when it comes to the postmodernist professors' paychecks. Then they might think that it's objectively wrong to underpay them. But most of the time, they are denying objective reality and telling kids that. And the New Age ideas also deny objective reality. They might tell you everything is an illusion. Now, if someone says that, you should point out that statement, therefore, must be an illusion as well. You see, the point here is one of these self-refuting arguments that people throw against the faith, but they end up refuting themselves. They cut off the branch they're sitting on. Like if someone tells you there's no such thing as truth, you should point out, is that true? Well, you can't know anything for certain. Well, is that? How do you know that for certain, okay? Or you have people like Bertrand Russell, Richard Dawkins, Frank Tipler saying that a claim isn't meaningful unless you can scientifically test that claim. Okay, that is a claim. Go ahead and scientifically test that claim. Put it in the lab and test it for me. You see, it fails its own test. Or you have Christians are wrong to judge that some behaviors are wrong. Well, if you call someone judgmental, you're making a judgment on that person. See, Jesus told us to judge righteously, not according to appearance. But funnily enough, you never have the secular media ever quoting John 7:24. See, Jesus only forbade hypocritical judgment, but commanded righteous judgment. Or you have people who don't like guys like me in the church because we're trying to use rational arguments to defend the faith, and they will argue with you that you shouldn't be using arguments. Or you have cultists who say, I shouldn't use the word Trinity, I should stick to words that are found in the Bible, and I point out the word Bible is not found in the Bible. So you see self-refuting arguments. Now, another thing with science that's necessary is an orderly universe. And this is the key problem for any other worldview, because if Zeus and his gang were in charge, you wouldn't expect order in the universe, because every god has his own domain and his own rules, and they're capricious, they can change their mind at any moment. But the Bible reveals a God of order, a divine lawmaker. And this is a key point. You see, atheism can't give you an orderly universe. You can't go from the premise there is no God to the conclusion the universe is orderly. It doesn't follow. And if the New Age ideas were right, the universe is one big thought, so it could change its mind at any moment. Now, another one is the dominion mandate of Genesis 1. We're supposed to have dominion over the rest of creation. See, if creation were divine, there'd be no science. You couldn't investigate a divine creation, but the Bible's clear there's a distinction between the creator and the created order. And man doesn't have dominion over other men, you see. So experiments on humans are just wrong. I mean, that implies things like human cloning, artificial human cloning. I mean, not natural human cloning. Identical twins are natural human clones. That's fine. But artificial human cloning, embryonic stem cell research, abortion, all these are man taking dominion over man. And same with slavery, which is why the great evangelical Christian William Wilberforce opposed slavery so strongly for decades until he got the whole horrible thing abolished. And this is why science actually started really in the Middle Ages in Europe, a sort of Christianized, mere Christianity type of Europe, where you had at least a belief in God as creator, Jesus as the Son of God, the Bible's God's Word. You see, you had a basically Christian worldview, even though there are things we would disagree with about the medieval church. They definitely had a sort of Christian worldview. And this is why we have such a huge advance in science in the Middle Ages. All these things, compass, paper, printing, stirrups, gunpowder, appearing in Western Europe, and then Western Europe actually developed them to an enormous degree. See, that often the Middle Ages are called the Dark Ages, but they really in some ways should be called the Brilliant Age. When you think of how many things developed there, like spectacle. I see some of you guys are wearing a Dark Ages invention. See, the eyeglasses were invented in the monasteries in the 13th century, and they also developed the science of optics, the study of light. And then mechanical and clocks were invented, and same with windmills. Water power was very well developed, blast furnaces to make steel. And even the heavy plough for agriculture. So at the height of the Middle Ages, the population in Western Europe was about 3 times the peak of the Roman Empire. That's how much more advanced they were than the pagan Romans that people want to idolize. The Middle Ages actually was far more advanced than the Roman Empire was, and yet they're called the Dark Ages, even though that's also where the universities were invented. Oxford University is invented in the Dark Ages, and same with the Gothic cathedrals, works of architectural genius. And there are a lot of lies told about the Middle Ages. One of them you may have read in your textbooks, that Columbus was the only enlightened person who believed in a global earth, and everyone else believed in a flat earth. That's a complete and utter lie. Because let's go back to one of your own great English Christian scholars, the Venerable Bede, an Anglo-Saxon monk in the 18th century, and he said, we call the earth a globe, a perfect globe, and not circular like a shield, but like a ball. You get, he's very unambiguous what the shape of the earth was, and this is over 700 years before Columbus made his voyage. So everyone understood what the true shape of the earth was in the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages. And then you go right to the height of the Middle Ages. The leading apologist and theologian Thomas Aquinas wrote in his famous Summa Theologiae, which became the textbook for the medieval church, theological textbook. And he said, he's trying to talk about proofs. How do you go about proving things? So he got something which everyone knew was true and was obvious. And he said, the physicist proves the earth to be round by one means and the astronomer by another. So the flat earth was something so obvious they didn't have to actually explain it any further. So you can be sure all the educated church people understood what the true shape of the earth is. And in fact, the leading flat earther today is actually an evolutionist who believes in global warming. Which is ironic because often creationists and deniers of global warming sceptics are called flat earthers, and yet the leading flat earther is one of them. So you see, so many things have been taught about the Middle Ages that are totally, utterly wrong. But in fact, the Reformation went even further than the Middle Ages because in the Reformation, what was rediscovered was the plain, objective understanding of the Bible. And here is a professor of the history of science, Peter Harris. He's Australian, but he worked in Oxford University. And it's interesting how he says the Bible and its literal interpretation have played a vital role in the development of Western science. Now, if you were to listen to Dawkins and Bill Nye and all these people, they say if you have the Bible, you're going to ruin science. And yet here is Dr. Harrison saying there's thanks to the plain understanding of the Bible that modern science even arose in the first place. And the reason is, according to another historian of science, Stephen Snowball from Canada, that this objective understanding of science of the Bible rediscovered in the Reformation, just taking the text objectively as it would have been understood by the original readers. That's what literal means, is what the original readers would have understood, including the figurative language. So when Jesus said, "I am the door," it doesn't mean he has knobs and hinges. But the literal meaning would be what Jesus was conveying to his hearers and readers. And it was this objective understanding that was applied to nature. So instead of going by what, say, Aristotle believed about nature, they went and investigated nature objectively. So they did experiments to find out what was actually true. So it's applying objective understanding of the Bible to objective understanding of nature, which is a huge step forward in the development of science. Now, one example, Aristotle, the great philosopher before Christ, he said a heavy object falls faster than a light object. And no one bothered to do the test. But the real scientist said, well, okay, let's see what actually happens. Drop them. And you'll find that the heavy object and light object fall at the same acceleration, apart from air resistance. But on the moon, I've seen it in a vacuum chamber, a lead weight and a feather in a vacuum, at the same rate. But this, you had to experiment to find out. You see, if the Bible doesn't say what God has done, the only way you can find out how God upholds his creation is to do an experiment and see how he works. Now, another thing to think about with science is that our thoughts must be rational as well. But the thing is, it's interesting that the rationalist societies can never justify rationality under their own worldview. You see, the Bible is clear. God made us in his image. God is rational, therefore we should be rational as well. Now, in John's Gospel, right at the beginning, it says, in the beginning was the Word. Now, the word for word in Greek is logos, which is where we get logic from. So therefore, being Christ-like is to be logical. So we have ample justification for logical thought because we're made in God's image. But you see, evolution can't really provide that. All evolution can do is select for survival advantage, no matter what, how illogical or false your beliefs are. If it leads more offspring, then that's what natural selection will give you. Then they're talking about silly things like the God gene and such like, supposedly explaining the origin of religion. But let's see what John Cleese, one of your best British comedians, says about this. All this entire notion is quite amusing.
Hello. We scientists have now located a gene which we scientists believe gives people the need to believe in God. In other words, this God gene releases chemicals into our body which create the impression that there is meaning in the universe. And this God gene is just here, between the gene which we scientists now know makes us eat coconut ice cream after a fish dinner, and this gene here, which causes people with weak egos to grasp around desperately for simple explanations. Now, the discovery of this God gene is a big step forward in our quest to show that every bit of human behavior can be explained away mechanically, because we've now also located the gene which makes some people believe that every piece of human behavior can be explained away mechanically. And it's here, right next to the gene that makes you go to see Nicolas Cage movies, so that's another puzzle solved. And right under this gene, which can cause you to forget that since the 1920s, quantum physics has destroyed forever the idea that everything can be explained mechanically. Now, the gene which causes us to forget this obvious fact is very dominant in some people, especially me. And we scientists now know that it's closely linked to this gene here, which gives you such a weak sense of self that you hang on to anything that makes you feel more secure emotionally, whether it's fundamentalist religion or a reductionist view of the universe, which is right over this gene here that makes you want to punch people in the head when they take the scientific process and subject it to their pathological literal-mindedness. Thank you. I needed that. And by the way, we now know that there is a gene that causes you to say, thank you, I needed that, just there, when you were punched in the head.
Okay, so hopefully I've given you a little bit to go on about why science had a Christian worldview. As I say, I've got a whole talk on that, the Christian roots of science, so I only sort of skimmed the surface of that. Now, another thing to think about is why I do the sort of things I do, and one of it is actually to help, at least the church, have answers to what we believe. In fact, we're told to give reasons and answers and to love God with all our mind. That's the greatest commandment of all, includes loving God with our minds. There's nothing in the Bible that says you have to check your brains in at the church door. And one thing you might like, because we're going to have a Q&A time. In fact, we wrote a book called the Creation Answers book, with 60 questions and 20 chapters, because these are the questions that keep on coming up in Q&A times. And this is part of the starter pack, which has my first book, Refuting Evolution, combined with the Creation Answers book, and basically a free DVD. So it's a real Jewish bargain. Another book you might like is Basic Christianity for Sceptics, which is about what the title of my tour in the UK, and this is about why Christianity is true and other religions are false. And one, of course, very important thing is that Christianity believes in a risen Saviour, while the founders of other religions rotted in their tombs. And this is actually combined with the Creation Answers book in a special pack as well. Now let's talk about some science a bit more. Now I've hopefully given you the reason why science works in the first place, which is why it's illegitimate for atheists to try and throw science at Christians, because their own worldview cannot justify the science they're trying to use. They have to steal it from the Christians and then throw it back at Christians. No, that's not going to work. But I talked about the flood right at the beginning, so let's look at that a bit more. And one thing to think about is where fossils fit in. Loads of fossils around the world. Now, this is an explanation of where fossils form, how they form. This is from an Australian high school biology book. You can probably find the same sort of explanation in the museums around the world, the secular museums. Now, the idea is this fishy is happily swimming along, but eventually it dies, it sinks to the bottom. And then you have the mountains eroding away slowly and gradually over millions of years, washing silt into the ocean and slowly burying that fish to form a fossil. Now let's do some real science here. What happens to fish when they die? Yes, you're correct. What even before that, though? It floats, exactly. So what do you think of this picture here? I mean, those of you who have a fish tank, a goldfish bowl, when your goldfish dies, where do you scoop it from, right? You see, you don't need to be a PhD to refute evolution, just simple observations like this. And as he's quite correctly pointed out, a floating dead fish will rot away and it will be eaten by other things. So this is not going to form a fossil. See, even if it reaches the bottom by it breaks apart, reaches the bottom, there are things in the bottom that chop up dead things. Not only bacteria, but also you've got bone-eating worms called ossidax that just destroy any carcasses. And if you don't believe me, I'm sure there's some beaches nearby where you can go scuba diving and check it out for yourself. Find me some fossilizing dead fish on the ocean floor now. No, it doesn't work, does it? So here is a better explanation. We start with this animal, but this time you have the global flood erupting. And the Bible is quite clear that it began in the oceans, the fountains of the great deep. burst forth. Great deep means ocean. So you're having these huge underwater mudslides produced by all the gigantic eruptions going on there. And of course, when you have this gigantic mudslide, the poor fish hasn't got a chance to escape, so it's buried. But now the scavengers can't get to it, and it's held in place. But the soft parts might rot away, but not always. But the bones are hard enough that it takes some time for them to be replaced by the minerals in the mud and turned into stone. So you've got the mineral where the bone was. But to get a fossil, you have to bury it quickly before it breaks apart. I mean, you got some farms around here. I think I saw some sheep and cattle on the way here. How many sheep and cattle fossils have you ever seen? Plenty of sheep and cattle die on farms. Where are the fossils? You see the point applies to land as well. Now let's look at some fossils to show you what I'm talking about. And again, this comes from our Creation magazine, which is full of sorts of articles like this. Now this is an ichthyosaur, a reptile version of a dolphin. This is about 2 meters long. But I said mother ichthyosaur because look here, she's giving birth to her baby here. So is this creature lying on the ocean floor for millions of years, slowly giving birth? I mean, I've heard of long, difficult labor, but rarely. And so some of you guys seem to be experts at keeping fish. Now, when you feed them, do they eat quickly or slowly? Quick or slow of eating? I think quick as well. So what do you think of this picture here? Snap frozen in the middle of his lunch, right? So imagine you go out from here and you go to McDonald's for your cholesterol burger, you chomp, and then you're suddenly fossilized in this position. You see how fast it must have happened to fossilize them in this position. And on land we see some things which must have been fossilized really quickly, like these fighting dinosaurs. They're in the middle of a fight, the Velociraptor on the right and the Protoceratops on the left. They're in the middle of a fight. And yet whatever buried them was so fast they didn't have a chance to break off their fight and escape. Now another thing about dinosaurs that have been discovered in the last 20 years are soft tissues in blood, in dinosaur bone. Now these are meant to be 65 million years old, and yet after removing the bone, what's left behind are soft and stretchy blood vessels. They're elastic, so they've got the elastic proteins in there. Under a microscope they see blood cells. You see the nucleus here because reptile blood cells have nuclei, unlike mammal blood cells. So these are reptile blood cells. And you have dinosaur animal protein like actin and collagen. These are animal proteins, not from contamination. And then there's also DNA in dinosaur bone. It's quite special, the dinosaur DNA discovered in the last few years. And the thing is, to find DNA something is a well-known probe called DAPI. And what this does, it lodges in the groove, a minor groove of the double helix, and sends off a fluorescent signal. And so it means this is showing there's a double helix of DNA there. You know, famous double helix, the spiral staircase, of DNA that Watson and Crick discovered about 63 years ago. Very important that. But it means, you see, every turn is about 10 units, 10 of the building blocks, the information letters, the bases of DNA. So 10 of these for one turn. So to get a double helix, you have to probably have 100 units intact. The problem is, though, you may remember the Nobel Prizes announced late last year. The Nobel Prize for Chemistry was awarded to these 3 scientists. And according to the Nobel Prize site, this is what they were awarded it for. In the early 70s, scientists believed that DNA was an extremely stable molecule, but Thomas Lindahl demonstrated that DNA decays at a rate that ought to have made the development of life impossible. So he discovered that DNA is in reality is extremely unstable. So we shouldn't even be alive. But the point is, he realized therefore that living things must have amazing repair machines to undo the damage to your DNA. And his 2 co-winners discovered different types of repair machines which are vital for all life. And one thing which is interesting is that DNA has the instructions to build its own repair machines. But if you didn't have repair machines already, then those instructions will be degraded because its DNA is breaking down all the time. But here's another example of this. The general belief that DNA is rock solid, but in fact it's highly reactive. On a good day, about 1 million bases in the DNA of a human cell are damaged. And your cell has about 3 billion bases, and 1 million per day are damaged. So if it wasn't for the repair machines, you'd be dead really quickly. And here are some figures for DNA instability. And this is the time to completely breaking apart into its individual building blocks. So the point is, if you froze it to -5 Celsius and protected it in bone, as these experiments were done, the maximum survival time is about 7 million years before it's completely broken apart. And yet the dinosaur bones are allegedly 10 times older than that maximum survival time, and the DNA is still intact. I don't think it's intact enough to clone a dinosaur from it, but it's still quite intact. And then they say the dinosaurs, everyone tells you dinosaurs lived in tropical climates. So you look at the figures again, you look at a fairly warm day, not tropical, but the DNA would last about 20,000 years and it's completely broken apart. So finding DNA in dinosaur bones is very good evidence against the millions of years dogma that people throw at you whenever they mention dinosaurs. The fact that you have DNA, proteins, and blood cells and blood vessels is very good evidence they're not millions of years old. Another thing you may have heard of to supposedly prove millions of years is carbon dating. Now, carbon dating means you've got an unstable type of carbon called carbon-14, and it decays over time. And what they tell you is the half-life. Now, you can measure the half-life, okay? After one half-life, only half of it's left. And then you have a quarter of it left after 2 half-lives. After 3 half-lives, an eighth left, then a 16th. Now, the half-life of carbon-14 is about 5,500 years, okay? Not very long. So if you do the mathematics, you could calculate. Imagine the whole Earth was nothing but carbon-14. You can work out that in 1 million years, it should all have gone. You should not be able to detect any carbon-14 with the most sensitive equipment. There's no carbon-14 to detect after 1 million years. So the point is that if you're finding carbon-14 and stuff, you know it can't be very old. Not as old as the evolutionists want anyway. I mean, old by our standards. Like for instance, diamonds. A diamond is a type of carbon. It's also the hardest substance on Earth, apart from the human heart. So it means once the diamond is crystallized, it's nothing can get in or out of that crystal. It's so hard. And the point is they're supposed to be over 1 billion years old, and yet the diamonds have carbon-14 in them, which shows they couldn't have existed long enough for the carbon-14 to have decayed. And so in Creation magazine a while back, I wrote an article called Diamonds, a Creationist's Best Friend, where I talk about that. Now I want to talk about design of things, but I want to sort of bust the myth of the millions of years, because if you haven't got millions of years, you haven't got evolution, just hasn't got time to work. But I'm saying that time, even a long time, would not help evolution. Evolution fails under a long time frame as well as under a relatively short time frame, but it totally fails under a short time frame. And the Bible teaches a short time frame, and so does real science. But now it's important to talk about the design of things, because that's where Darwin is most famous, because he wanted to explain away the design and creation by pointing to evolutionary processes. Now it's interesting that Darwin, first of all, was an evolutionist in geology. He believed in slow and gradual processes over long periods of time. And that was what led to the biological evolution of slow and gradual processes explaining living things. But it's interesting that Dawkins himself said biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Well, maybe that's because they were designed for a purpose. Maybe you should just use what his actual science is telling you. Of course, he doesn't believe that. He believes things evolve with no purpose at all. But that's against what his actual science is telling him. And it's interesting, the Apostle Paul says, guys like him have no excuse because the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. So let's look at this. Let's look at some design things. No one would dispute this airplane was designed. Well, I hope they wouldn't. But how do you know it's designed? Well, for one thing, it has lots of correct components. But you realize an airplane is made up 100% of non-flying parts. That's a worry because I have to get back to Atlanta where we live. How is that going to happen? Well, the answer is they are organized correctly. So design means correct components, but also correct organization. And when you have organization, you know there's an organizer. This is real science. See, what's an alternative? See, evolution foundationally says if you have matter plus time plus energy, you get organization. So let's test this. Maybe a tornado through a junkyard would provide the energy required to put the jumbo jet together. How likely is that? But what if I told you this picture really is actually not so bad as it looks? Because really the tornado is hitting the jet plane and turning it into a junkyard. Now, does that sound better to you? Now, why is that? Well, the answer is there are many more ways of being a junkyard than being a jet plane. So simple. When you add the energy, you go to the more probable state, which is the junkyard. And if it doesn't matter how long a tornado is going through the junkyard, it's not going to make a jet plane out of it. I mean, another example, do you have to tell your kids to mess their rooms up? Well, the reason is there are many more ways of having a messy room than having a tidy room, okay? So when you have the pure energy of what was resulting is going to be a messy room, not a tidy room. You have to have the intellect to make a tidy room, okay? Now let's apply this to living things. Now living things are enormously more complicated because they can copy themselves, like your kids are sort of copies of you. Now jumbo jet doesn't have little jumbo jets. The Boeing factory makes you jumbo jets, but it won't make you another factory. A photocopier makes you documents but doesn't give you another photocopier. But living things, by definition, can copy themselves. And your body is made up of 100 trillion cells that are copying themselves. Which means that even a simple living cell is enormously complicated. If your cells weren't copying, then your body wouldn't grow or repair its injuries. So it's very important. There's so much complexity in even the simplest life. So let's see how that could have formed. Again, the evolutionary idea is matter plus energy plus time. And I'll test this with a frog and a blender. I turn the switch on, I'm providing the energy we need. So see what happens when we put the frog in a blender and turn the switch on. You get a frog smoothie, okay? So why did the frog turn into a frog smoothie? It's once again, there are many more ways of being a frog smoothie than being a frog. Simple. Now, if I left this going for millions of years, you think a frog's going to hop out of there eventually. But you got all the components for a frog there. In fact, if you sterilized and sealed and canned your frog smoothie, it's safe to eat for many years. Maybe you don't want to try it with a frog smoothie. The same principle applies to canned sardines or canned peaches. Georgia is good at peaches, okay? The same sort of principle. You see, you get food poisoning because of bacteria, living creatures that give you food poisoning. Okay, but as long as this can is sterile, no bacteria, no germ is going to form in that can to give you food poisoning. The only way you'll get food poisoning is if the seal was broken and it came in from outside. But as long as you have the sterilization, the seal is intact, no germ will grow in there. Even though you have all the components and all the energy, all the time you like, there's no germ that's going to grow in that can. So you should think that canned food destroys the idea of evolution, because real science says life comes only from living things, okay? That's called the law of biogenesis. Evolution says that life once came from non-living chemicals. That's a component of evolution called chemical evolution. But it's a vital part of the atheistic worldview that life came from non-living chemicals. But it's not science. This is a blind faith position. So then let's look at some of the things that are needed. For instance, living things use energy. And in the cell, the energy is stuff called ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is the energy currency of life. Now, you don't know it's happening, but your body is making its own weight in ATP every day and consuming it. And cyanide kills you by stopping ATP production, so it's very important. But now we know it's made by the tiniest motor in the universe.
This animated sequence shows the ATP synthase enzyme in operation. The animation is based on an incredible series of scientific discoveries. Only the colors show artistic license. ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, is the energy currency of the cell. ATP is produced by a tiny molecular rotary motor, rotating at up to 7,000 RPM. These are so small that 100,000 would fit side by side in a millimeter. A current of protons drives the motor, unlike man-made electric motors which use electrons. This portion of the enzyme is where adenosine diphosphate is combined with a phosphate ion in the presence of a catalyst to produce ATP, which is then released, making way for the next cycle. A top view of the enzyme shows the sequential operation. Almost every biochemical process in your body requires ATP. Such a nanomachine exhibits all the characteristics of super-intelligent design. ATP is vital for life, and many of these motors were needed before the first living cell could exist. An evolutionary impossibility.
And do I have to tell you, Darwin didn't have a clue about this motor and about all the other motors I'm going to show you. Now let's get back to this aeroplane. You know what would rarely clinch a design of this aeroplane is finding the instruction manual in the glove compartment. That would show it had a designer, right? This is what we have in living things. We actually have not only the machinery, we have the instruction manual, the famous DNA molecule that I already discussed. As I showed you, it's too unstable to have arisen in any sort of primordial soup. Now, the current theory, the most popular theory of origin of life is what's called the RNA world. RNA is sort of like DNA, but much less stable. Now, I've shown you DNA is incredibly unstable, so the idea of an even more unstable molecule being the beginning of life is totally preposterous from any chemical perspective. But this actually stores the instructions or the information to make you who you are. Now, the simplest living thing, the mycoplasma, which has to be a parasite, it's so simple it must be a parasite on more complicated things. It has about 600 kilobytes of information. But modern studies have shown that this information must be incredibly compressed because it took over 100 computers running for 10 hours to duplicate what the simplest cell can do. So we have machine instructions for machines, but it's just really the most advanced computer operating system in the universe. There's nothing in Silicon Valley that even approaches what DNA can do. Now, in each of your cells, you have about 3 gigabytes of information, again, highly compressed, or about 1,000 Bible-sized books of information. That's in each of your 100 trillion cells. That's how much information you have, but incredibly compressed. Now, think about a book. See, a book must have an author. See, even though the book is written with ink molecules on paper, the information in the book didn't come from the ink. You couldn't pour ink on a page and get a book. You had to have the author arranging the ink into letters, words, sentences, paragraphs. Now, in the same way, there's nothing in the chemistry of DNA to make it write the instructions of life. Once again, just as the information in the book is external to the chemistry of the egg, so is the information in living things external to DNA chemistry. And the thing is, it must be coded. You can't understand my book unless you read English. You see, if I told you that I'm going to give you a gift, which we are going to offer you a gift actually, now you'd be happy if I gave you a gift, right? It's something you get for free, right? It's a present. Now, if you were Germans, do you think you'd be happy with a gift? Well, it actually means poison in German, okay? Now, I met a German in New Zealand who told me when he first arrived in the country, he was appalled at our Christmas customs because we try and poison our families. So you see the importance of getting the right message, the right language, otherwise you get the wrong message. If you have the wrong language of DNA, you get the wrong protein, so your cell could not work, your living things could not work unless you had the right language there. Now, DNA is quite special because it's like several different languages going on in the same part of DNA. It's like a book you can read in English and in German simultaneously and read backwards. So multiple languages are at work in the DNA. A computer program has one language, so DNA rarely eclipses anything we can do. So DNA has to be read by something, but how it's read, it needs certain decoding machines to decode the instructions to build the proteins that make us who we are. And I'm going to show you what actually goes on in living things when the DNA information is decoded. It's a multi-step process.
This animation demonstrates how the digital information encoded within DNA is used to direct protein synthesis. This is a DNA double helix containing the digital code which directs the cell in all aspects of operation. And here we see a protein complex called an RNA polymerase traveling down the DNA strand. As it moves down the strand, it carefully unwinds the DNA, preparing it for transcription. Inside the polymerase, we see a single-stranded copy of the original instructions being assembled as individual bases are positioned and added to the growing strand. A stop code marks the end of the protein specification, at which point this copy, known as a messenger RNA transcript, exits the polymerase and heads towards a two-part chemical manufacturing machine called the ribosome. While the messenger RNA moves towards the ribosome, transfer RNA molecules attach to specific amino acids in preparation for assembly. As the messenger RNA transcript passes through the ribosome, the process of translation begins. Using the instructions encoded on the messenger RNA as a template, the transfer RNA molecules align specific sequences of bases to corresponding amino acids, creating a protein chain. As this chain exits the ribosome, it is met by chaperones which prevent premature folding, while escorting the protein to a barrel-shaped machine called a chaperonin. This machine helps fold the protein into the precise shape required to perform its function. Although it is unclear how the chaperonin achieves this, we do know that accurate folding is essential in order for the protein to accomplish its intended function. Once the protein is complete, it is released into the cytoplasm to do its job.
So you see, so many different steps have to be working perfectly, otherwise this wouldn't work. Now, mad cow disease is a failure in that last step alone. Everything else is working fine except for that last step. That's what happens with mad cow disease. It's called a prion, where the protein is folded wrongly and is very dangerous. Okay, so these are things that have to be totally functional, totally interconnected and coordinated. Otherwise, it's going to fail completely. Now, another point to understand is that DNA actually has the instructions for its own decoding machine, which leads to a very vicious circle, a chicken and egg type problem. You know, which came first, the chicken or the egg? You know, that sort of thing. You see, you've got the same sort of thing here. Which came first, the DNA instructions or the machines to read those instructions, which are themselves encoded in the DNA? And in fact, the instructions, the decoding machines must be working almost perfectly, otherwise the instructions will be degraded when they make the next generation of machines, which means the next machines are going to be bad, not as good, and therefore they do an even worse job of reading the instructions, which make an even worse job of the machines. So you get this error catastrophe, with things ground to a halt really quickly, unless these things are pretty much perfect. I mean, a very high degree of accuracy. And now the decoding machines use energy, which means they use ATP. Now, ATP is made by those motors I showed you. But to build the motors, you need the instructions on the DNA read by decoding machines using ATP made by those motors. So there's a three-way circle. And of course, you can add the repair machines to that circle as well, which also have to be working perfectly. And then DNA is amazing in that the instructions can be copied to the next generation. So you didn't really get your mother's eyes and your father's ears. You got the instructions for your mother's eyes and father's ears copied to you. And this is how it's done.
Using computer animation based on molecular research, we are now able to see how DNA is actually copied in living cells. You are looking at an assembly line of amazing miniature biochemical machines that are pulling apart the DNA double helix and cranking out a copy of each strand. The DNA to be copied enters the production line from bottom left. The whirling blue molecular machine is called helicase. It spins the DNA as fast as a jet engine as it unwinds the double helix into two strands. One strand is copied continuously and can be seen spooling off to the right. Things are not so simple for the other strand because it must be copied backwards. It is drawn out repeatedly in loops and copied one section at a time. The end result is two new DNA molecules.
Of course, DNA has the instructions for its own copying machine. So again, if you haven't got the copying machines, you couldn't pass on those instructions for new copying machines. Another thing is, think about DNA. It's packed up into your cells into a part called the nucleus. So it's microscopically packed up. But in fact, if you unravel the DNA, the total length would come to about 2 meters. So it's a very long and skinny molecule. And those things get tied up in knots. And here's a problem for DNA, just a physical problem with DNA. And I'll show you what happens with that.
Let's consider what happens as DNA unwinds during replication. As DNA unwinds, it acts like this rope when we pull apart its two strands. As you pull the strands apart, twisting tension builds up in the rest of the coiled portion. It is actually adding one twist to the remaining rope for each twist pulled out of it. At some point, you can't separate the strands anymore. The remaining rope is too tightly twisted. If you relax your tension on the rope, it will twist around itself in a supercoil. It is releasing tension. If you want to keep pulling the rope apart, you have to release the tension periodically, and one way to do this is to cut the rope and splice it back together. This problem has been best characterized in small circular DNAs. There are two methods of dealing with this problem in DNA. One cuts only one strand of the DNA double helix, and the other cuts both strands. Let's look at the first. Topoisomerase I enzymes cut a single strand of the double helix, pass the other strand through the cut, and reseal the break, relaxing the overwound molecule, which now has one fewer twist. Topoisomerase II enzymes do the same thing but with both strands of the double helix. Topoisomerase II cuts both strands of a double-stranded DNA and passes another double strand through the break and then reseals the break. So if a molecule of DNA is supercoiled, topoisomerase II can remove the supercoiling, 2 twists at a time, to yield a relaxed circle.
So in fact, your DNA couldn't even work unless you had these machines operating to untwist the inevitable twisting that will come about. And again, of course, DNA has the instructions to build its own topoisomerase enzymes. But again, to read the one set of instructions, you'd need to have these enzymes working. Otherwise, you couldn't read that set of instructions for that one machine, let alone all the other things needed for life. So you see, all these things have to be working together for life to work. And here is a big problem here. Here is the problem that natural selection can't give you this. Now, natural selection was discovered by creationists before Darwin. See, that it's part of the biblical creation model, natural selection. But see, natural selection is defined as differential reproduction. What this means is this thing is fitter than this thing, so this thing leaves more offspring. So before you can talk about natural selection, you must already have reproduction. So you can't use natural selection to explain the origin of reproduction. Therefore, you can't use it to explain the origin of first life. And this is what helped Anthony Flew, the leading atheistic philosopher, for about 50 years from Oxford University, says Richard Dawkins overlooks the fact that Darwin pointed out that the whole argument began with a being which already possessed reproductive powers. And this is the creature, the evolution of which a truly comprehensive theory must give some account. Darwin was well aware that he'd not produced such an account. And now it seems to me that the findings of more than 50 years of DNA research have provided materials for an enormously powerful argument from design. So this is what actually led him away from atheism. This sort of consideration of what even the simplest life requires, because natural selection can't get you this far. It can't get you any further either. That's a whole different talk. But just to summarize what I'm talking about here, of how important information is to understand living things. And here is one evolutionist who admitted the problem. Most of the workings of a cell are best described not in terms of material stuff, hardware, but as information or software. And he points out no known law of physics able to create information from nothing. So the problem is, how did stupid atoms spontaneously write their own software? Nobody knows. And yet he will claim evolution's a fact, but no one knows where the information came from, which is vital to understand where evolution came from, how evolution could possibly work. And let's see if Richard Dawkins, the world's leading evolutionist, can explain any better.
Professor Dawkins, can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
So as you see, he couldn't answer the question, even though he's the world's leading evolutionist. So another thing he's also said, it's quite amusing, he said evolution has been observed. It's just that it hasn't been observed while it's happening. But let's face it, I mean, I hope this has been interesting, but I understand that people won't remember a lot of what I say, which is why we have the books and DVDs along with some nice refreshments down in the basement. But one thing I want to mention really as an important resource, because it keeps on coming every quarter. You see, it's a 4 times a year magazine for the whole family, and it's called Creation Magazine. And it has a children's section in it. It has all sorts of variety of articles. Every interview interviews a Bible-believing scientist. It's got things like the age of the earth, the flood, dinosaurs. And the point is, it's the thing that will neutralize all the propaganda that comes out in the secular media, the school system, the Discovery Channel, if you watch the American stuff, or you got the Walking with Dinosaurs in Britain. All these things are pushing evolution in millions of years, so this is the perfect antidote for it. And we're even offering special gifts for a subscription as well. Like we even have a digital version of it. Now, there's actually a gift involved, and this is an English gift, not a German gift. Okay, if you pay for 4 years, for 1 year, you get a free back issue, so it's 5 for the price of 4, so it's a real Jewish bargain. And then if you pay for 3 years, you get a back issue plus a DVD as well of your choice. And this is what Dominic is going to start passing around, these sign-up sheets, these clipboards here, and all you need to do is put your name and your address so we can post it to you. So a very handy thing to have, especially with the gifts involved. And here is one of the older issues. Here, see, it's quite attractive. We're trying to make it as more attractive as time goes by. Here's one article that might be interesting. It's called How Do Dating Methods Work? And this is not about how boys meet girls. This is about how old things are and how we know. And here's an example of one of our scientists who interviewed a geologist. The famous Galapagos flint finches, and why they are very good evidence of variation within the created kind, not one kind evolving into another. And here's an interesting one about Mars. They believe the global floods happen on Mars, and yet Mars hasn't got a drop of liquid water on it, but they don't want to believe in a global flood on this planet. Now, it's interesting that you've got a man called Alfred Russel Wallace, who is Darwin's co-discoverer of evolution. He lives in Bournemouth, where I was a few days ago. Now, he actually calculated that if you flattened the mountains down and raised the ocean floor so everything was totally smooth, the water in the ocean would cover the Earth to almost 2 miles deep. So there's plenty of water to cover the whole Earth. All you have to do is make it more even. And another thing is by a man who's a head of design engineering at Bristol University, Dr. Stuart Burgess, and he is actually leading the way in biomimetics, which is copying the design of living things. He's a brilliant engineer and a total Bible-believing creationist who realizes that his puny brain is nothing compared to what God has done. So he's actually looking to the design in nature to design things like micro-air vehicles based on dragonfly flapping, which he analyzes in minute detail. He also was the designer of the British Olympic bike too. So you can see, if you see the British Olympics, that's his bike you're talking about. And even kids sections here. Like here's my little niece reading it with me. We try and start them young. And also, just want to mention, we do have lots of DVDs, and we're actually on a huge special as well for the DVDs as well. These are very nice DVDs on all sorts of different topics, and they're on a special for my UK tour. And now I've got a bit of time while this is going around actually to answer some questions that you might have before we go to have a nice set of refreshment that this church has generously provided for us. I'm happy to answer some questions that people might have about creation, evolution, the Bible, Genesis. Whatever you want as long as it's sort of with the on topic. That's the main thing I'd like. So who wants to ask me a question? The only rule I have in Q&A times is that what you say must end in a question mark. Clever. Yes, sir.
What's the most difficult question that you have to answer from the evolutionary science? What's the most convincing argument that you find difficult to answer?
The question is, what's the most difficult argument from the evolutionists? I can't think of one really. Sorry. I mean, a load of the best arguments they use are really straw men against creation. They accuse us of believing in fixity of species, that species don't change, but in fact the biblical model is that you have variation within the created kind, and that can be quite wide variation. And creationists understood this before Darwin, that the kinds would vary, but there would not be one kind evolving into another one. So there's a huge amount of misrepresentation of what biblical creationists really believe with a lot of the arguments that appear on the media. And also creationists have often, like about, say, 20 years ago, the radioactive decay thing was a problem, but now we've got the evidence like carbon-14 and diamonds. So throwing their own favourite methods back against them has been what we've been doing the last few years. So really, I don't have anything to fear. I don't think, of course, we don't want to be overconfident or misrepresent what evolutionists believe, but I think we're coping pretty well because they usually ignore what we say, which is a false sense of security on their part. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
How did attack and defense mechanisms develop so quickly after the fall?
Okay, you're talking about this. This is one of the questions that are actually answered in this, chapter 6 of this book. As well as my commentary, I talk a bit about more of that. Some of them, they may be ready-made. You see, you've got sharp teeth and fangs, which could easily be used for eating vegetables. I'll show you why. I mean, you have things which look like they are designed for attacking things, but they probably worked perfectly well in the plants, in the vegetable world. So look at this thing here. What do you think of this thing? What is this? What do you think this is?
Dog.
Well, I shall tell you, what do you think it eats then? It's a fruit bat. See, it has the sharp teeth and the carnassials, the slicing back molars called carnassials, but it's actually a plant eater. And the thing is, look at this admission here from an Australian zoo. All the bears have teeth designed for eating meat. Their diet consists mainly of plants. Wow. Or this creature here, the piranha. Now, my brother-in-law used to keep a vegetarian version of this called the pacu. Has strong, really powerful jaws, the strong teeth, but it ate lichens. It ate the hard lichens. And it seems that the piranha has lost a layer of the teeth, and therefore it now has to nip other animals, you see. So, and well, there's this one here, a bird of prey that eats a lot of plants. Again, the sharp claws in the beak actually enable it to be very good as a plant eater. There's also a bird of prey called the oil bird, which is totally vegetarian, and is also an echolocating bird. And unfortunately, unlike bats, which are ultrasound, so we can't hear the rackets, the oil birds are actually ordinary sounds, so you do hear the rackets. And interesting, even the dinosaurs, theropods, are the group that includes T-Rex and Velociraptor, and it seems that even most theropods ate plants. And this is an article I wrote Creation.com, vegetarian for theropod dinosaurs. But there are things also, when you think of bacteria, disease germs. What about these ones? Well, the point is often these are degenerate versions of benign ones. It seems like when you look at things like the leprosy, the dangerous one, it seems like it's lost about 80% of its genome. So it has to be a parasite. But it seems to be a degenerate thing compared to the free-living germ, which is actually benign. I mean, your human body, your body has about 10 times more bacterial cells than human cells. Yeah, you're basically more of a germ than a human, actually, sorry, if you want to be biological about it. But the germs are usually pretty good for you. The thing is, when you have some degeneration of these things, sometimes they start causing disease like cholera. It seems what happens, it loses its chemotaxis, which is the ability to find chemicals it wants to find, and so it becomes a dangerous parasite. Mycoplasma, as I said, the simplest living thing, is a parasite, which also is quite clearly a degenerated germ. So that's where the disease germs come from. I think viruses maybe be degenerate parts of cell which now can't even reproduce themselves without attacking things. And what about poisons? Here's the number one rule of toxicology: the dose makes the toxin. And this should actually, there are people who try and scare you away from vaccination because of all the toxins in there, but in fact, you calculate they're about 1,000th of the toxic dose. I think I calculated if you have 1,000 flu shots, you might get a toxic dose of mercury. Very important rule for your health, that dose makes the toxin. See, oxygen and water can be toxic if you have too much of it. It's a very sad story here, actually, because some premature babies were overdosed with oxygen and made them blind. It's a very common cause of blindness in premature babies was overdosing in oxygen. And I think of things like Botox. It's the deadliest toxin in the world, but in fact people inject the stuff. The botulinum toxin for Botox to sort of deaden the muscles that cause wrinkling. I don't recommend it actually, but it clearly doesn't seem to hurt you too much. Now another thing to look at is, as I've mentioned here, they could have been used in a vegetarian lifestyle, but also you got this thing here that God foreknew the fall. So some things that we see that arose quickly, God already knew the fall would happen, so he basically designed these structures and turned on the information at the fall. So you have latent genetic information that's turned on at the fall. And that's what basically happens in a human body when it develops. Things are being turned on and off when the embryo develops. That's why, see, your eye cells have all the information for bone and everything else, but you've got a bone poking out of your eye socket. So the bone information and everything else is switched off as the embryo develops. And that's probably what happened with some things. Now, see, jellyfish. I believe the jellyfish stinging cells is a catapult mechanism. It's clearly a designed catapult mechanism, but they say that jellyfish were designed to sting vertebrates. But under evolution, vertebrates evolved millions of years after jellyfish evolved. And yet the earliest jellyfish are quite clearly no different from the the current ones. So again, why did it evolve something when there's nothing to sing? So the biblical account of this actually makes more sense. And I say, Genesis, the Creation Answers book, it also got a whole chapter in a whole section in my Genesis commentary about this issue of defense, attack structures, bad things. Okay? Question? Go ahead, sir.
I'm currently studying environmental systems at IB level.
Sounds good.
Going over natural selection.
Yes.
Could you go into a little bit more detail on natural selection and Christianity against natural selection and evolution?
I would be happy to do that. Let me just give you my slides on natural selection, just to show you that it has nothing to do with evolution. You see, in fact, creationists thought of it before Darwin. So it's very, the evolutionists will often give you examples proving natural selection to be true, but it doesn't prove evolution to be true. So it's important to understand the difference of what natural selection is and what it isn't. So, see, the real evolutionary idea, which is under dispute, is that all living things in the world evolved from a single-celled organism that evolved from a primordial soup. So it's from goo to you via the zoo. And this means that information increase, okay, because a primordial soup has 0 information. The mycoplasma has 600 kilobytes and we have 3 gigabytes. So it's information uphill. So it doesn't mean that things change. It means that you've got this information increase. But what happens, what is going on here, I'll give you an example of what happens when you're first of all breeding things. Because you have your information in pairs, one half from your mum, one half from your dad's. And when you marry and have kids, you pass on one half your spouse, the other half, so your kids look like both of you. Now these dogs here have medium fur, because they've got a gene here, a bit of your DNA that says make short fur, and this one says make long fur. And if they're co-dominants, they combine and make medium fur, okay? And so what happens? When they interbreed, they can pass on one or the other. So they could pass on their short genes like this, and the doggy has short fur. Now, what if they pass on one of each? They have medium fur, like their parents. Now, what if they both pass on a long fur gene? You see, you've got new varieties here. Darwin thought this was new information, but in reality, the information was already there. But Darwin ignored Gregor Mendel. He was a creationist, a monk in what's now Czech Republic, okay? And he realized that God has already pre-programmed the genetic variation so the offspring could have lots of variety and the capability of adapting to different environments. But the information was already there in the first place. Now imagine these dogs go through the ice age. Who's going to do better here? Well, the furry ones are protected from the cold. The other ones are going to die of the cold. And so what happens? They die of hypothermia. The only ones left who can pass on their genes are these long-furred ones. So they can only pass on long-furred genes, and therefore the offspring are entirely long-furred, you see. Now, this is an example of natural selection in action. Okay, but what's actually happened here is a culling force, not a creative force. It has eliminated the genes for short fur. So if the climate warmed up, they've no longer got the information for making the short fur. They'd overheat. I mean, that's why you have food banks to keep the wild variety of various things. So you've got the information there. In case the crop you're breeding dies out, you've got to have the wild variety. Otherwise, you've lost that information. The problem is, these dogs just don't lose the short fur information. They lose everything else they have. I mean, do you guys, some of you older people, no offense, you might remember strawberries tasting a lot better than they were. They might not have been as big, but they're probably a lot more flavoury, right? I mean, even my wife remembers that, you see, and she's not old. That's the point. You see, the thing is, what happens, they breed the big strawberries, so what they're doing is eliminating all the smaller ones, which means you're eliminating all the genes for sweetness and flavour as well. So you get these big but pretty mushy and dull sort of strawberries because you're eliminating so much of the other information that strawberries carry, you see. So bad idea. And so the thing is, you can keep this going for millions of years. You're not going to get new stuff. All you're doing is culling the stuff. It's removing, it's the opposite direction from what evolution requires. So what evolutionists have to go on is a mutation, a typo when genes are copied. Here's an example of a mutation. See, the British bulldog has to be born by C-section. No good in the wild because the mother and pup will both die in the wild. That's one generation, it's gone. That's how bad it is. Or you have this one here called TNR mutant, or totally naked rooster. Now, it's good for KFC, say, because you don't need to pluck it, but it's horrible for the rooster because he freezes in winter and fries in summer. So the problem is, I've shown you here that the real evolutionary idea is this increase in information, but what we actually see is sorting out what's already there, and we see natural selection culling part of the information, and then we see mutations corrupting the information. So in none of these cases are we ever seeing the information going uphill. Now, if you look at our DVD called Evolution's Achilles Heel, we also explain why antibiotic resistance is not information increase, because the example we give is a certain cell pore that is pumping in nutrients but also pumps in the antibiotics. So you're pumping in your own executioner. Now, if there's a mutation on that pump, then the antibiotic doesn't get pumped in. So it's actually a resistant germ, but it's actually a disabled germ, because it's lost the ability to pump in its nutrients, doesn't pump in those well. So in fact, a lot of the so-called super germs would actually be wiped out in competition with the wild germs if they were out of the hospital, out of the antibiotic-rich environment of a hospital, put them in the soil, and the ordinary bacteria would easily wipe them out, outcompete them, because all the resistant ones are disabled in some way. And there are a lot of different examples of antibiotic resistance always being a disability. It always seems to be a deleterious one. Another one is streptomycin attacks the ribosome, the protein-making thing. So if there's something a little bit deformed about the ribosome, it doesn't work as well, but the antibiotic can't attach to it. So it's got a disabled ribosome, but at least it survives because the antibiotic can't lock the ribosome up completely. Okay, and another antibiotic called oligomycin attacks the ATP motor. It attacks the bottom rotary parts. And so a lot of these things attack things, and if you have a certain change, that actually ruins it a bit, but actually means the antibiotic can't attack it. You see, so I can go through a lot of these examples of antibiotic resistance, and yes, it's natural selection, but it's also still a downhill change. So it's not the change that will turn bacteria into biologists, or amoebas into anthropologists, or prokaryotes into professors. Question, anyone? Yes, sir.
We have on British TV a very plausible astrophysicist called Professor Brian Cox.
Oh, him, oh yeah, okay.
There was a recent series of Forces in Nature. It was a 4-part series. I think in part 3 he purported to show how a primeval soup could end up producing self-replicating cells.
Oh, it's a total bluff. I mean, he doesn't understand chemistry if he thinks that. It's a complete bluff what he's doing there, because the real chemistry goes against him. I've explained that you're not going to get that because you have all the different components are unstable in the primordial soup. It's just not going to work. DNA and RNA are too unstable. And then where do you get the membrane for the cell? Because you'll find, you try washing in hard water, what happens? The soap is basically similar chemically to what's in the cell membrane. It's called amphiphilic. It actually has one end that grabs on water and one end that repels water, you see. But with calcium ions in the hard water, it precipitates. That's what the scum is, you see. It's a precipitation. But the seawater, you can't wash with soap and seawater. So you've got the same problem with trying to get these molecules for the membranes. They'll precipitate out in the seawater. And these are sort of well known to chemists, but Cox obviously is no chemist, and that shows. Now, we've got critiques of some of his earlier shows on our website. If you look at Brian Cox on the creation.com site, you'll see some critiques of it. But I'll be interested to see what sort of bluff he's trying. I haven't seen it, but I'm interested to see what bluff he's doing, to see and what sort of things he has to gloss over. Like another thing that you'll see in the Evolution's Achilles Heels movie is what happens, you see, to get a cell, you have to go from little molecules into big molecules. Now, when that happens, it kicks out water every time. The problem is, that means that when you have it in water, the water adds and breaks up those big molecules into small molecules. This is basic chemistry. Anyone trying to build a protein, the last place you want to do it is in water. I mean, any inorganic chemist will think you're a fool trying to do it in water, because you try to exclude water from the reactions, and yet they're saying all these reactions are occurring in water. I mean, this is chemical nonsense, what these guys are trying to do. And I think they're only motivated because of their faith. If they're atheists, by faith, they have to believe somehow life came from inorganic chemicals, and all they're trying to do is show how it happened. But they've already assumed before looking at the evidence that it must have happened somehow because we're here. That's basically what it is. In fact, in New Zealand, a German professor living in New Zealand, where I grew up, he's had an article published, a paper published, said why the RNA world theory is the worst theory of the origin of life, apart from all the others. That's basically what it is. They're driven to desperate things, but everything else is even worse than the RNA world, which is what I presume Brian Cox talked about, was it, you think? Oh yeah, I've written on that too. A long time ago I wrote about hydrothermal vents, and the problem is a lot of these molecules are unstable at high temperature. Even the building blocks of DNA, like a ribose, which is RNA, and the bases are very unstable at hydrothermal vent temperature, which is why the famous Stanley Miller, the famous pioneer of these spark and discharge things to make proteins from ammonia and methane, he said that a hydrothermal vent idea was ridiculous because these things are so unstable at those temperatures. So once again, that's why some people actually want a cold origin of life, because that's the only way you're going to stabilize some of these things. But then if it's cold, the other reactions don't work. You see, you basically, you've got a problem if you do have it hot and a problem if you don't have it hot, you see, because you've got certain things going wrong either way. Yeah, so, okay. Question, anyone? Yes, sir.
Some years ago, Michael Behe wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box.
Yes.
He professed to be writing from an evolutionary perspective.
Yes.
Querying how it is that he had discovered in his research certain levels of what he described as irreducible complexity.
Yes.
From which he could produce no answers that would accord with current Darwinian evolutionary theories and philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
It was basically appealing for help from
Yes. Right.
Can I ask, to your knowledge, has anybody been able to answer any of his basic queries?
Okay. I don't believe so, no. I mean, a lot of people bluffing their way into it, but I think that his basic thesis is sound, and Behe's written a subsequent book called The Edge of Evolution, trying to show what could mutations plus selection actually achieve. And it seems the best it could do is something like the resistance of malaria parasites to chloroquine, because you need to have two mutations occurring but simultaneously to get chloroquine resistance, and that's a very hard thing to do. That's why chloroquine took a long time to get resistance, because they had to have two mutations at once. And even those mutations actually were downhill. It ruined something, but you need those two mutations for that to work. And that's about as far as you can go, because malaria parasites reproduce very quickly, and yet that's the best thing you could do, is two mutations. So to try to get the whole things like the molecular machines he talked about, he likes a bacterial flagellum. Now, since you asked about that, I do have articles on flagellum, and the point is they believe, they try to tell you the flagellum evolved from a plague, these bacteria that secrete things into their hosts and all that. But the experts say that the plague secretory thing is actually a degenerate version of the flagellum. They believe the flagellum came first, and the plague thing happened afterwards. And you have Dawkins and Kenneth Miller and all these people saying, well, there you go, solve Behe's problem. In fact, the experts in the area say, well, no, the flagellum must have come first, and no explanation as how it could have happened. But I do think, if I do say so myself, my book called By Design is better than his. It's more up to date, for one thing, has more examples of design, many more examples of design, but also Behe's a bit confused because he wants to believe in evolution and design, and you can't do both. It becomes very, very confused. And it also, under the Behe view of millions of years, he can't solve the problem that you asked the first question about defense and attack structures. Why would God design one thing to hurt something else? Darwin asked these sorts of questions. So if you haven't got the fall, you really haven't got a good way of explaining this. So I'd say the intelligent design movement by Behe and all these guys is deficient because it doesn't actually answer the questions of the bad things. And why would things become extinct? Well, again, you've got the fall, you have the flood. So my book has chapters on explaining the things, and there's a video here, a companion called God the Master Designer. And so Behe talks about the flagellum and the immune system, and I think the eyes, how the eye turns light into electricity. I think it's the things he likes to do, but this has a lot more things anyway. So maybe one more question, you think?
How is it they believe we come from fishes in the sea? The next instance, they believe we come from monkeys. I have yet to see a monkey turn into a human being.
The point is they believe it happened over millions of generations. You're not going to see a monkey turning into a human being. They all believe there are a lot of intermediate steps between the two, okay? So the thing is, though, these intermediate steps didn't leave much in the way of fossil record, you see. So they're trying to have heads I win, tails you lose, because evolution is too slow to observe in our lifetime, but it's too fast to observe in the fossil record. Yeah, weird, isn't it? That seems like a good time to stop. So thanks very much again for having me here, and thanks for coming. And I'll probably remember just there's some books and there's also refreshments downstairs. So thank you for putting those on too. Thank you.